The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It screamed across the frozen plains, a ghost with a throat full of glass, and slammed against Elsie Rowan's little cabin. Snow wasn't just falling, it was a wall of white, erasing the world 1 inch at a time. The windows were frosted over, blind eyes staring into the storm. All that was left was the tiny, flickering world of her hearth. Elsie stood at one of those windows, her breath a small cloud against the frozen glass. She was 23, but the loneliness had carved her face like an old piece of wood. Years she'd been out here. Years since the town had looked at her, the lone survivor of the fever, and whispered the word that had driven her into the wild. Cursed. The silence in the cabin was usually a comfort, a thick, warm blanket. But tonight it was a weight. It pressed on her chest, heavy as the snow piling up on her roof. She looked around the small room, the patched quilt on her bed, the jars of preserves, a sad little row of summer memories, the old Bible, its corners worn soft from her mother's hands. It was a life, but it was a life half-lived, in the shadow of other people's fear. The storm got worse. The wind sounded like a hungry animal, scratching at the door, sniffing at the cracks in the logs. Elsie pulled her shawl tighter, her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm. She listened for the usual sounds. The groan of the pines, the far-off cry of a wolf. But then she heard something else. Something that didn't belong. Hoofbeats. At first, they were faint, like a drum beat in another room. But they were steady. Heavy, and there were too many of them. No one rode in a storm like this. No one sane, anyway. She pressed her face to the window, peering through a small patch she'd rubbed clear. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like the earth itself was vibrating. Then she saw them. Flickering lights in the blizzard. Torches. Huge, dark shapes moving behind them. They were circling her cabin, surrounding her. Her blood went cold. Instinct screamed at her to douse the lamp, to hide, to pretend she wasn't there. But her feet were nailed to the floor. The knock came. 3 solid thuds that shook the entire cabin. Elsie jumped, a small cry catching in her throat. The silence that followed was terrifying. Louder than the storm, louder than her own ragged breathing. Then a voice cut through the wind, deep, rough, and full of command. "You will open. The storm will claim us all." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Her hand, trembling, reached for the wooden latch. Every story she'd ever heard about Apache raiders flooded her mind. Fire, blood. But the voice, it wasn't the voice of a killer. It was the voice of a man who knew what survival cost. She took a shaky breath and lifted the latch. The door flew open with a roar, sucking the warmth out of the room and blasting her with a spray of ice and snow, and they came inside, one by one, 7 of them. They were giants, each one built like an oak tree, and they were shirtless. In the middle of a blizzard, their chests were bare, their skin glistening with melted snow. Their hair was long and wild, and white as the storm they'd just walked out of. Their eyes found the firelight and seemed to drink it in. They were old eyes, ancient. They filled her small cabin, their size making the walls shrink, their breath turning to steam in the air. The last one in, the eldest, pushed the door shut against the raging wind. He was taller than the rest, his silver hair brushing his scarred shoulders. He turned his gaze on her, and Elsie felt like she'd been pinned to the wall. He was beautiful in a way that made her want to run. Too wild, too real. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The other men moved with a quiet purpose. One knelt by the fire, warming his calloused hands. Another, with clever eyes, went straight to her door, examining the broken latch she'd meant to fix for weeks. They moved like they owned the place, like they had always been there. Elsie finally found her voice. It was a thin, useless thing. "You can't stay." The leader stepped closer. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He didn't threaten her. He didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at her, his gray eyes seeming to see right through her skin, right into the lonely corners of her heart. "We will not leave," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This night is too long for that." She wanted to argue, to scream, to tell them to get out of her home. But she knew he was right. To send them back into that storm would be murder. Fear and conscience waged a war inside her, and it was tearing her apart. She stumbled back, bumping into her small table. 7 pairs of unreadable eyes followed her every move. She thought of the people in town, the ones who called her cursed. What would they say if they could see her now? And yet, a strange feeling whispered through her. The feeling that her life, her real life, was just beginning. The fire popped. A sudden explosion of sparks. The wind wailed. The leader's gaze never left her face. He took another step, closing the distance between them, and he spoke the words that would change everything. "You are mine." The cabin itself seemed to hold its breath. The storm fell silent. Elsie's knees gave out, and she gripped the table to keep from falling. She tried to find the words to deny him, to fight back, but her throat was locked. There was only the sound of the fire and the 7 giants breathing in her tiny home. Her exile was over, but she had no idea if she'd just been rescued or captured. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with the scent of wood smoke, wet leather, and something else. Something wild and old. Elsie felt like a mouse in a cage of lions. She moved to the hearth on shaky legs, her mind numb. She grabbed the pot of thin stew she'd made for herself and set it on the coals. It was an act of pure instinct, a woman's work. It was all she knew. The men settled around the fire, their massive bodies forming a circle of warmth and quiet power. They didn't speak, but their silence was a conversation she couldn't understand. One of them, a man with shoulders as wide as the doorframe, started to expertly repair her broken latch with a strip of hide from his belt. He didn't ask. He just did it. Her home was no longer just her home. The leader, the one they seemed to follow without a word, didn't sit. He stood by the door he'd just closed, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his belt. His name, she would learn, was Natada, and his eyes never left her. The words he'd spoken, "You are mine," hung in the air, more real than the walls around her. It wasn't a threat. It felt like a fact. A stone dropped into the quiet pool of her life. She served the stew, her hands trembling so badly she nearly spilled it. The portions were laughably small for men of their size. She braced herself for their anger, their scorn. But they took the wooden bowls with a quiet reverence. They ate slowly, deliberately, as if her watery stew was the finest meal they'd ever had. A hot flush of shame, and something else, something she couldn't name, rose in her cheeks. The people in town had always looked down on her meager life. But these men, these fearsome strangers, treated her offering like a gift. Still, the fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach. What was she doing, alone, with 7 Apache warriors? The town would hang her for this. The shame was a familiar, biting thing, but a new feeling was rising with it. Defiance. The town had left her to rot. Their judgment was nothing but empty noise. When she collected the empty bowls, Natada finally spoke again. "You fear us." It wasn't a question. The spoon she was holding slipped from her fingers and clattered against a bowl. "You came unbidden," she managed to say, her voice tight. Any woman would be afraid. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fear is wise." He glanced at the others, a silent warning passing between them. But one of them, the youngest, with a restless energy and a smirk that never quite left his face, leaned forward. "Or fear is betrayal," he said, his voice sharp. "She may run to her people. Tell them we are here." The accusation hit her like a slap. "I have no people," she said, the words cracking with a pain she thought she'd buried. "They cast me out. They wouldn't come. Not for me." The fire crackled in the sudden, heavy silence. The man who had been fixing the door, Chenoa, looked at her with a new interest. Another, a heavy-set man named Dason, had a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. Even the smirking one, Bidzi, looked away. Natada stepped toward the table. He drew his knife. The blade shone in the firelight, long and wickedly sharp. Elsie's breath caught in her throat, but he didn't point it at her. He laid it on the table between them, a gesture she couldn't decipher. A threat? A promise? "Then you are bound here," he said, his voice low and final. "Your fear belongs to us, but so does your shelter." Bound. The word echoed in her mind, bound by the storm, bound by their presence, bound by her own loneliness. She turned away, hiding the tremble in her hands. The room was hot, filled with the heat of the fire and their bodies, but a cold shiver ran down her spine. She had spent years praying for an end to her solitude. Now, looking at the 7 strangers who had claimed her home, she had a terrible feeling her prayer had been answered by something that wasn't God. As the night wore on, the men settled down to rest, their massive forms arranged around the dwindling fire. The cabin was filled with the soft sound of their breathing. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. It was the sound of her world being turned upside down. Natada didn't sleep. He sat at the table, his knife still gleaming between them, his eyes fixed on her. His gaze was a physical weight, a silent, unyielding pressure. The storm raged. The fire died down to embers. And Elsie Rowan knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the real storm wasn't outside her walls anymore. It was inside. The embers pulsed in the darkness, a dying heartbeat in the center of the room. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, until a voice cut through it. It was Takakota, a man whose eyes held a permanent shadow of grief. "We walk because no place calls us back," he said, his voice like stones grinding together. He stared into the embers as if seeing ghosts. Not tribe, not town. Chenoa, the one who had fixed her door, let out a short, bitter laugh. "We walk because we refuse their wars. Our own people called us cowards for not wanting to shed blood for land that was already lost. The whites call us devils. We belong to no one." The words hit Elsie like a punch to the gut. Belong to no one. She knew that feeling. She knew it in her bones. The town had branded her not for a crime, but for the simple, unforgivable act of living when her family had died. The fever had taken her mother, her father, her little brother. And when she had emerged from the sickness, weak but alive, the town hadn't seen a miracle. They'd seen an omen, a curse. "They said the same of me," she whispered, the words tearing from her throat before she could stop them. 7 pairs of eyes snapped to her. The intensity was suffocating. "I lost them all," she said, her voice shaking but growing stronger with every word. "My family. They said I should have died with them, that it was wrong for me to survive. They said God had turned his face from me. So I left, before they could do worse." The cabin was utterly still. No one moved. No one judged. They just listened. It was the first time she had spoken of it in years, and in the faces of these 7 strangers, she didn't see pity or disgust. She saw understanding. Dason, the big, solemn man, nodded slowly. Yona, who hadn't spoken a single word, shifted, and the firelight seemed to soften the terrible scars that covered his face and arms. Natada's gaze was piercing. "You live, though the world says you should not," he said, his voice quiet but ringing with a strange power. "That is not a curse. That is strength." Strength. The word was so foreign she almost laughed. No one had ever called her strong, but hearing it from him, it felt true. A tiny, fragile seed of something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. But Bidzi, the young, sharp-edged one, shattered the moment. Or it is cunning, he sneered. A woman alone, surviving when others perish. Perhaps she has tricks the rest of us don't. The heat of anger flooded her cheeks, chasing away the cold fear. I have no tricks, she said, holding out her hands, showing them her calloused palms, the small scars from years of hard, lonely work. Only these. Natada shot Bidsy a look that could have frozen fire. The younger man fell silent, his smirk finally gone. Elsie's heart was hammering, but it was a different rhythm now. Not fear, but a wild, unfamiliar courage. She had spent years cowering from whispers. Tonight, she was facing down giants. Chenoa spoke again, his voice serious. We are hunted, woman, by our people and yours. If the men from your town learn we are here, they will come with rifles. Do you understand what that means? She did. It meant blood. It meant fire. It meant the end of her quiet, miserable little life. To send them away was to be safe. To let them stay was to invite death to her door. She looked at their faces. Exiles, outcasts, hunted. Just like her. The choice was simple. And it wasn't a choice at all. You may stay, she said, her voice clear and steady. A change swept through the room. It was like a heavy blanket being lifted. Natada's stern face softened, just for a second. He reached for the knife on the table, but instead of taking it, he pushed it across the worn wood until the hilt was pointing toward her. A test, a gift of trust. Her breath hitched. The knife gleamed in the dim light. In its polished steel, she saw her own reflection. Small, pale, and terrified. But her eyes were burning with a light that wasn't just the fire. The men began to settle again, a silent pact, sealed. But as her gaze met Natada's across the table, she saw it. The fire in his eyes burned with something more than trust. It was a promise, a claim. He had given her a choice, but he had known what her answer would be. He had seen the exile in her soul and recognized it as his own. She understood then. The real danger wasn't the storm. It wasn't the men from the town. It was him. It was the promise in his eyes, a promise of a life that would be anything but quiet. And as the first hint of gray dawn touched the frosted windows, she realized something else. These men were not just Apache. The way they endured the cold, the ancient stillness in their eyes, the sheer, unnatural size of them. They were something more, something older, and she was now part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world of blinding white and deafening silence. When Elsie stepped outside to fetch water, the air was so cold it burned her lungs. The snow was deep, unmarked, a perfect, clean slate. Except it wasn't. The tracks of their horses were a chaotic circle around her cabin, a clear sign to anyone who might pass by. Her heart sank. It was an invitation, a beacon. She could already hear the whispers in town. Elsie Rowan, the cursed witch, harboring savages in her home. The shame was a bitter taste in her mouth, but as she returned to the cabin, the smell of wood smoke and the sight of the 7 men inside stirred something else in her. A stubborn pride. They had trusted her. And that trust was a fire in her belly, burning away the shame. She found Natada at the window, staring out at the snow-covered trees. They will come, he said without turning. Who? She asked, though she already knew the answer. The men of your town, Chenoa said from his spot by the fire. He was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone setting her teeth on edge. They will see the tracks. They are not brave men, but fear makes them cruel. The thought of them coming here, of facing their judgment and their hatred, made her stomach clench. She had run so far to escape them, only to have her past hunt her down. Perhaps she will welcome them, Bidsy said, his voice laced with its usual venom. Play the victim, beg for their mercy. Enough, Dason rumbled, his deep voice shaking the small room. He looked at Elsie, and for the first time she saw true pity in his eyes. She knows their mercy is a colder death than any blizzard. He was right. She had begged them for help after her family died. They had given her nothing but scorn. To turn to them now would be to admit they had been right about her all along, that she was weak, cursed. "I will not send you away," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. The scraping of the knife stopped. Every man in the room was looking at her. They weren't just men seeking shelter anymore. They were her men, her responsibility. "Then you choose against your own people," Waya, a restless warrior with fire in his eyes, said. "I have no people," Elsie replied, and the words felt like the truest thing she had ever said. "They left me to my fate long ago. Let them curse my name one more time. It makes no difference." Natada finally turned from the window. His gaze was intense, stripping away all her defenses. But it wasn't a look of possession anymore. It was a look of recognition, of an equal. "You stand with us, then," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she breathed. The tension in the room broke. It was as if they had all been holding their breath, waiting for her answer. Yona, the silent, scarred warrior, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. A pact had been sealed. But as Elsie looked out the window, her newfound courage faltered. Dark shapes were moving along the ridge, figures on foot, rifles slung over their shoulders. They were sharp and black against the endless white. The men from the town, and they were coming straight for her. She stumbled back from the window, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. "They're here," she whispered. "They found us." The men rose as one, a silent, menacing wave of muscle and resolve. Waya's jaw was tight, his hand clenched into a fist. Chenoa held his newly sharpened knife. But Natada didn't reach for a weapon. He stepped toward her, his eyes searching her face. "And you, Elsie Rowan," he said, his voice a low, challenging rumble. "Will you stand with us now? Or will you let their hatred break you, as it did before?" She looked past him, at the men who had shared her fire, who had seen the outcast in her and not turned away. She thought of the years of loneliness, of being the town ghost. Fear was a cold hand gripping her heart, but something else was rising to meet it, a hot, fierce anger. This was her home. These were her people now. "I will stand," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. The men closed ranks around her, their presence a solid, living wall. Outside, the crunch of boots on snow grew louder. Voices, sharp with malice, carried on the wind. Natada stood beside her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He put a hand on the doorframe above her head, his towering form a shield. "Then you are one of us," he said, his voice a vow. And then the first furious pound came on the door, a sound like a hammer blow against her heart, the sound of her old world trying to smash its way in. The door shuddered under the assault. "Elsie Rowan!" a voice roared from outside, a voice she recognized as the town blacksmith, a man with hands like hammers and a heart like a stone. "We know you're in there with them heathens. Send them out, or we'll burn this cabin to the ground with you in it." Her past was screaming at her through the door. Every ounce of fear she'd ever known told her to obey, to throw open the door and beg for a mercy she knew they wouldn't give. But when she looked at the men around her, she saw something else. She saw Yona, placing his massive, scarred body between her and the door. She saw Takakota, his sad eyes now hard as flint. She saw Natada, his gaze fixed on her, waiting. "This is your choice," he said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "Open that door for them, and we walk away. Keep it closed, and you are with us. Forever. Forever." The word was a terrifying, beautiful promise. She looked at the splintering wood of the door, and then at Natada's face. She saw her reflection in his stormy gray eyes. She wasn't the cursed girl anymore. She was a woman making a choice. "I will not give you up," she said. A flicker of something, pride, respect, crossed Natada's face. He pulled the long knife from his belt and pressed the hilt into her hand. It was heavy, real, and shockingly cold. "Then you are our blood now," he whispered. Just then, the door burst inward, splintered and broken. A rifle barrel poked through the opening. Before anyone could react, Waya, with a roar of pure fury, lunged forward and grabbed the barrel, twisting it aside as a shot exploded, the sound deafening in the small space. The cabin erupted into chaos. Settlers poured in, their faces pale with a mixture of rage and terror. They were hunters, but they had never hunted prey like this. The 7 men met them head-on. It wasn't a fight, it was a storm. Chenoa's blade was a blur of silver, disarming a man before he could even aim. Dason moved like a bear, his fists landing with sickening thuds. Bidzi, laughing like a madman, darted between bodies, a whirlwind of motion. Elsie was frozen, the knife clutched in her hand, until Yona grabbed her and pulled her behind him, shielding her with his body. From behind that wall of scarred muscle, she saw Wa take a bullet to the shoulder. He staggered, blood blooming dark on his skin, but he didn't fall. He just roared louder and charged back into the fray. The settlers, who had come for an easy victory, found only a nightmare. They were farmers and blacksmiths, not warriors. Against the raw, ancient power of the 7, they stood no chance. Their courage broke. They scrambled back out the door, stumbling over their fallen, their shouts of anger turning into screams of fear. In minutes, it was over. The clearing was empty, save for the rifles they had dropped in their panicked retreat. The cabin was a wreck. The door was destroyed. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Waya leaned against a wall, clutching his shoulder, his face pale but his eyes blazing with triumph. Natada turned to her. The firelight flickered across his face, making him look like something carved from stone and shadow. He gently took her hand, his fingers closing over hers, guiding the knife back into its sheath on his belt. "You stood," he said. The words were simple, but they held the weight of a ceremony. "Not for us, for yourself." She looked at the broken door, the blood on the floor, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The life she had known was over. The town would never take her back, not after this, and she didn't care. "Let them curse me," she whispered, her voice raw. "I have chosen." The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks toward the ceiling. The men watched her, their faces grim, but their eyes holding a new light. Kinship. Belonging. Natada placed his large, warm hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of possession. It was a gesture of acceptance. His eyes burned into hers, sealing the promise that had been made in the heart of the storm. "Then you are ours," he said, his voice a low, unbreakable vow. "And we are yours." The broken door let in the cold wind, but for the first time in her life, Elsie Rowan didn't feel cold. She was surrounded by giants, her home was in ruins, and a whole town now wanted her dead. But she was finally home. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the shattered doorway, a new, chilling thought took root in her mind. The settlers had been terrified, but their fear wasn't just of the 7 men. When they had burst in, their eyes had been wide, darting into the dark corners of the cabin as if expecting to see something else. They hadn't just been hunting Apaches. They had been hunting monsters, and they thought they had found them. The question was, were they right? The days that followed were a strange dream. The men worked with a silent, brutal efficiency. Chenoa and Dason fashioned a new door from fallen timber, stronger than the first. Takakota, his grief a constant, quiet presence, hunted for them, returning with deer that seemed to walk right into his path. Wa's shoulder healed with an unnatural speed that made Elsie's stomach twist. He was quiet, his usual fire banked, but his eyes followed her with a new, protective intensity. They were a family, a strange, broken and terrifying family. She learned their ways. They spoke little, communicating with glances and gestures. They moved with a grace that defied their size. At night, they would sit by the fire, and sometimes Takakota would speak of the old land, a place before their exile, a place of magic and shadows. He spoke of a great betrayal, a war between brothers that had shattered their people and sent them wandering. They were, he explained, the last of the Anak, a people who were not quite human. They were tied to the earth, to the storms, to the ancient spirits of the wild, and they were dying. "There is a blight on our blood," he told her one night, his voice heavy. "A curse laid upon us by the brother who betrayed us. It thins our numbers. We can no longer have children. We are fading from the world." Elsie listened, her heart aching for them. She saw her own loneliness reflected in their epic tragedy. One afternoon, while she was mending Waya's torn buckskin shirt, her needle slipped, pricking her finger. A single drop of bright red blood welled up. Before she could wipe it away, Yona, the silent, scarred Yona, was at her side. He moved faster than she thought possible. He gently took her hand, his touch surprisingly soft for a man so formidable. He stared at the drop of blood, his scarred face unreadable, but a strange light kindled in his eyes. He looked up at Natada, who had been watching them from across the room. Yona didn't speak a word. He didn't have to. A silent, urgent message passed between them. Natada crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt before her and took her hand from Yona. He looked at the tiny wound, then into her eyes. His gaze was so intense, she felt like he was seeing into her soul. "The fever," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "When your family died, what do you remember?" "Nothing," she whispered. "Pain, darkness, and then waking up, alone." "Nothing else?" he pressed. "A dream? A voice? A face?" She shook her head, her mind a blank, but as he spoke, a flicker of a memory, buried deep, sparked in the darkness of her mind. A face in the fever dream. A man with hair as white as snow and eyes like a winter storm. A man who had knelt by her bedside, just like this. A man who looked like him. "There was someone," she breathed, the memory hazy, unreal. I thought he was an angel." Natada's hand tightened on hers. He looked at the others, and she saw the same stunned, disbelieving hope on every single one of their faces. Even Bidsy's cynical smirk was gone, replaced by wide-eyed awe. "It was not an angel, Elsie," Natada said, his voice shaking slightly. "It was one of us, an elder, who wandered this land long ago. He found you dying. He could not save your family, but he saved you." "How?" she asked, her mind reeling. "He gave you a gift," Takakota said, his voice filled with reverence. "A single drop of his own blood, just enough to fight the sickness. He broke our highest law to do it, and was cast out for it. We thought he had died without a trace." Elsie stared at her hand, at the pinprick of blood. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he save me?" Natada's gray eyes held hers, and in them she saw a truth so staggering it threatened to break her. "Because he saw what you were," he said. "Your mother's people. They were not from this land. They came from across the great water, but their blood was old, like ours. The fever should have killed you, but his gift mixed with your own blood. It did something else." He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. At her temple, hidden beneath her brown hair, was a small white birthmark she'd had her whole life. As his fingers touched it, the mark seemed to shimmer, glowing with a faint, silvery light. "It awakened you," he breathed. The cabin was silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. The 7 giants, the last of a dying race, were staring at her not as a woman, but as a miracle. "The blight," Chenoa said, his voice full of wonder. The curse that says we can have no children. What if it is not a curse on us, but on our blood? And her blood is the cure. She was not just their shelter anymore. She was not just their kin. She was their future, their only hope of survival. The weight of that revelation was crushing. She stumbled to her feet, backing away from them, from the hope and desperation in their eyes. It was too much. Cursed witch, monster's savior, and now, the mother of a dying race? She turned and ran out the newly repaired door into the cold, clean air, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She ran until her lungs burned, until she collapsed in the snow at the edge of the clearing, the world spinning around her. She had wanted to belong somewhere, but she had never imagined this. She lay in the snow, the cold seeping into her clothes, the impossible truth warring in her mind. She was one of them, or something like them. Her survival hadn't been a fluke, it had been an intervention. Her curse was actually a gift. The loneliness that had defined her entire life was a lie. She heard a crunch of snow behind her and looked up to see Natada. He didn't come close. He just stood there, a dark, towering shape against the bright snow. "We did not know," he said, his voice carrying on the still air. "We were drawn to this place. We felt a call, a pull we did not understand. We thought it was just a place to hide, but it was you. It was always you." "What do you want from me?" she cried, the words raw and painful. "We want nothing you are not willing to give," he said. "We have been alone for so long, Elsie. We have watched our people fade, our stories turn to dust. In you, we see a dawn, a chance to live again. But the choice is yours. It will always be yours." He turned and walked back to the cabin, leaving her alone with the staggering weight of her new reality. As dusk began to fall, she returned to the cabin. The men were quiet, their hope a fragile, tangible thing in the small room. She looked at each of them, at Dason's quiet strength, Chenoa's sharp intelligence, Waya's fierce loyalty, Takakota's deep sadness, Yona's silent suffering, Bidzi's broken pride, and Natada's unyielding resolve. They were monsters to the world, but they were all she had. "I will stay," she said, her voice soft but clear in the firelight. "I will be one of you." A collective breath was released. The tension that had held the room captive shattered, and for the first time, Elsie saw a true smile on Natada's face. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes, making him look younger, less burdened. But their fragile peace was not to last. Later that night, as a new storm began to brew, a sound came from the woods, not the sound of settlers, something else. A low, guttural chanting, a rhythm that was wrong, that felt like it was scraping at the edges of the world. The men were on their feet in an instant, their faces grim. "What is that?" Elsie whispered, a primal fear creeping up her spine. "It is him," Takakota breathed, his face ashen. "The brother who betrayed us, the one who brought the blight upon our blood. He has sensed you. He has come to finish what he started." The chanting grew louder, closer. It was coming from all sides. The very air seemed to vibrate with a dark, malevolent power. Natada turned to her, his eyes blazing with a protective fire. "He will not have you," he snarled. But as he spoke, Bidzi, who had been standing near the back wall, suddenly let out a cry of pain. He stumbled forward into the firelight, and they all saw it. A dark, creeping corruption was spreading across his skin, like black veins, pulsing with a sickly light. The mark of the betrayer. "He found me," Bidzi gasped, his face twisted in agony and shame. "Years ago. He marked me. He's been watching you, through my eyes." The ultimate betrayal. The enemy hadn't been outside the walls. He had been sitting by their fire all along. The chanting stopped, An unnatural silence fell over the woods. And then a voice, colder than any winter wind, slithered into the cabin, seeming to come from the shadows themselves. "You cannot hide the dawn from the darkness, brother," the voice hissed. "Give her to me, or I will unmake you all." The final battle had come. Not against the town, not against fear, but against the ancient evil that had hunted these men for centuries. And Elsie, the cursed girl from a forgotten town, was standing right in the middle of it. She clutched the knife Natada had given her, its familiar weight a small comfort in the face of a nightmare made real. Her choice was made. She would stand, she would fight, and she would not let the hope she had just found be extinguished. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the world.